Reactive training systems.
So what is the point of tapering? Like, why do we need
Yeah,
it?
good question. Why bother?
Yeah.
Jim, are you going to educate us?
Jim, do you taper?
I can tell you my experience with my own, like how I taper. It seems to be pretty different from a lot of the people, or not totally different, but I seem to respond super well to tapering. Um, and the weird thing is, for the most part, that week that I'm tapering, the lift feels so heavy. Nothing's feeling good, and I think, I'm gonna bomb out of the meet because my openers are set too high. And I think a lot of that has to do with, I'm warming up a little bit less. There's less volume in general, so I don't really know how the lift is feeling because, how I've been doing is warm up to openers on Monday, and then I'm done with each lift. So it's like I don't know how that. I mean, that was like a easy lift, but you don't have like a lot of comparison like you do in normal training. Um, so tapering that whole week is weird, and it doesn't give you a lot of confidence leading up to the meet. At least not me. And then, well, for example, I just tapered for bench only. I did a mock meet, and my estimated 1 rep max in training was about 320, but at the mock meet I hit 335. And I think a lot of that has to do with how I train in general, and how I respond to adrenaline during, when you're supposed to peak, you're obviously at your strongest point. Combine that with some adrenaline and some caffeine, which I don't usually use during training, and I get a pretty solid response from that. I start screaming. I don't ever do that normally, and I'm able to crank out a few more pounds. Like I don't know a lot of people that can do that, but I definitely notice I can.
Well,
So
you mentioned the disparity between your estimated max and your actual max. Do you think that is possible to be a calculation error?
I think what it is for my bench especially is that I'm very conservative in training because my main goal is to not injure myself. I'm always worried about how my pec is feeling, and if it's feeling good, obviously I'll go a little heavier. So if I have a good day, that means my pec's not hurting. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm stronger. It just means I'm able to press harder without having any worry about an injury. And a meet day, almost consistently, I've never had any issues with my pec. I haven't strained my pec in a meet. It's always 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out when the intensity gets kind of high. And so I'm pretty conservative now because I'm like, there's no point in pushing it in training. I can wait until the meet where I can really push it and go all out, and hopefully I won't have to worry. So I think that's probably the biggest disparity, or reason for the disparity in strength or estimated maxes. And
Well, see, so that's really interesting, and you kind of touched on personality a little bit, and that's why I think the question is so interesting to begin with. Is that there seems to be a wide range, like I don't know, anything where it's just kind of one answer and that's kind of the same for everybody. It can be important, but it's not necessarily interesting. So I think tapering is one of those things that is highly, highly individual, and there are the general principles of tapering, and I've talked about those elsewhere, in terms of reducing your volume but keeping the intensity relatively high and keeping the frequency relatively high. Like that's like textbook tapering, right? You allow the fatigue to dissipate, but you keep all these efficiency improvements that you've built up and stuff like that. But some people don't respond very well to those volume reductions. Like I've used the example in the past of my bench press. It seems to be really sensitive to those sorts of volume reductions. So, and that kind of takes me back to Paulie's original question: is why bother? Why bother tapering? Because some people do seem to get that boost that Jim's talking about, but then other people don't.
There's so many variables involved, though. We have to come up with a logarithm to figure out every single variable, because if Jim's saying that, what I picked up just from what Jim was saying is that, injury, so his RPEs are going to be lower because he's a little more concerned about that. So I think there'll be naturally a bigger gap between what he's doing in a meet or in a mock meet. It doesn't matter, because then you're doing a total of maybe 5 or 6 reps before you get there. So there's there's a lot of variables involved, and so it becomes a very, very subjective thing. And I think that, like you said, Mike, it's too many people say that these are exactly what I have to do all the time to taper. I have to reduce and I have to maintain here, and then everything's going to be perfect. And it's not. It's not at all. I think there's probably a lot more science to tapering than or common science to tapering than we're given credit.
Yeah. Well, another thought process observation that I've had in the past goes something like this. Like, if you have a lifter who has an experience where they train hard and they're progressing, they're getting stronger every week, they're hitting PRs in training, and then they taper and they don't meet expectations. And this happens enough that it's a pattern, you know. So they're progressing, they're getting stronger, they're hitting PRs, but then when that taper comes, something happens. So you try a bunch of different tapers, and this dip always happens, Maybe they're sensitive to the volume drop, or maybe their psychological disposition doesn't respond really well to all that excitement, or any number of things. My question is, why do you have to taper? It's just kind of this thing that we take for granted sometimes. That's just what you do. That's how you do things. But I've had some athletes that are in that situation. So we more or less just don't taper. They train. We might take an extra 1 or 2 days off before the competition, but then they go do the meet. And like, people think of the taper as like this thing, then you slingshot your results, and that your results are much better than they otherwise would have been. I find that happens for some people, but it seems to be really personality driven to me. Like, some people just have a personality that feeds off of that energy at a competition. So I'm not sure really if it's the taper that's causing that slingshot effect, or if it's just the energy from the competition that's causing that. Because in other people, when they taper and they don't respond well to a taper, and then we kind of remove that taper, have them train all the way up to the meet, take 1 or 2 days off, and then go to the competition, the results where they used to have a gap, the results in the meet were lower than training results. Now that gap is smaller to non-existent, So that would seem to suggest that the taper wasn't helping, because if it's just a non-response to, if it's just that the only reason for that is that they don't respond well to the stimulus of a competition, well, that negative stimulus is still there, but we took away the taper and improved the results. So some people, it seems fairly obvious to me, some people just don't respond that well to tapers. And it's not like it's just this one taper and I've just tried the one. Like, we've tried a bunch of different methods, we've tried a bunch of different styles. It works sometimes and it doesn't work other times, and as far as a rhyme or reason why, I don't have something that suggests that yet.
Well, I agree. I don't think that a taper is mandatory. I think a taper is a tool that you can use if necessary. And I have, and I always say this. I'm fortunate in that I have the advantage where I can kind of see my lifters face to face when I'm working with them and when I'm training them, for the most part, in my gym. And some people, I'll say, come in for an extra day or two before a meet, depending on their disposition. Some people disappear for the last week because they got stuff to do. And that doesn't affect their lifts. And so what we're trying to do, I guess, is kind of, as coaches, is kind of even out the peaks and valleys throughout training, and then really just kind of cap it with a taper to some degree. To a full taper if someone's been really stressed out and they need a break, or to just, someone just wants to come in the gym and just keep going, and generally just kind of optimize everybody's lifting. It seems like that's what we need to do, is come up with the RTS taper calculator. It'll be a highly proprietary, top secret spreadsheet.
Right. Yeah. That sounds like something we would do, though.
Yeah. Coming soon.
Right. I don't know. It's a funny thing. I talk to Jake sometimes about stuff. it comes up in multiple different avenues where he'll say something along the lines of, there's a difference between, your most reliable result and your maximum result, and you might be able to do something to shoot for that maximum result, but it may not happen. You may miss pretty badly, and then there's a different protocol that would get you your most reliable result. I thought that was an interesting point of view, and I see something like that when it comes to tapering, I think. And it kind of goes back to this, like if you have somebody who's very reliably showing improvements all the way through their training, then what more do you want from that lifter by tapering them? And I realize I'm kind of taking a position here that sounds pretty anti-tapering. I mean, we still taper most of our athletes, and we taper them in a fairly traditional way. But the few that don't respond well to that, it's important. I know it's really important to them that we have some other tools in the toolbox, and we don't just keep hammering away and try. Well, I don't know, man. You're supposed to taper. I don't know what else to do here.
Right. So, well, I mean, it comes off to me, and I think we're all in agreement on this, is that if anything, we're anti-mandatory tapering. So kind of listening to the athlete, watching the athlete, making our own, our own observations based on their entire training cycle and feedback what we've gotten, and then we can make a decision on how to move them through the last week before their meet. And then part of it, honestly, is kind of, we always ask how important is this meet, and where does this meet fall in the cycle? Is it a and we'll often have train through meets where someone will just kind of literally just train right up to train through the meet, and just keep going. Other meets they need a rest, they need a break. To me it's not black and white at all. There's no, and I think that's where a lot of people make a mistake, is to say that you absolutely have to taper, and it's not necessarily the right thing for all people.
Sure.
Yeah, I've had some experience like talking to other coaches, and like I think it can kind of be a bit destructive to the lifter if your coach is so one-dimensional with how they approach the taper. I've heard people say, you should never train above 70% during your meet week. Like never should you do that. How does that? What happens when it doesn't work? Well, you should never train above 70%. So it must be you're doing something wrong. So yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely important, like Paulie said, to just make sure we're trying to adapt to the lifter instead of making them adapt to our strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. And something to kind of go along with that, I think you do see that. And I remember a while ago going to a competition, and then like I've pretty much always been a guy that trains the week of the meet a little bit. I used to, like, even if I'm tapering, I'm still doing something. When I went to a meet, and we're about 3 days out, and I was just doing my warm-ups, which now is not like a weird and shocking concept to most of us, but then it was, and people were like, "What are you doing here? You should be like, you shouldn't even be standing up. You're 3 days out."
Yeah,
I think I'll be okay. Like, I do this all the time. I'm pretty much used to it, and I do fine. I do fine in training.
Yeah, and it's also it's powerlifting. We have 9 lifts to do. Like, it's not like we're going to go run a marathon. And even still, I think even marathon runners still run 5 miles the week of their. I don't know exactly how they do it, but they still have some stimulus, and it's like we have 9 lifts. Like, what's the harm?
Jim, I just need some clarification here. You're saying that you think that we should run a marathon instead of tapering?
Yeah. Why not?
That's just crazy talk. You know how I feel about running. That's not going to happen. Or we're going to have a bunch of people saying that they just ran a marathon and 2 days before a meet, and why are they not feeling well?
I hope that happens, because I feel like I could convince somebody like that I could help them.
Yeah. Exactly. Oh, poor child, come to us.
Well, you just misunderstood.
Yeah, exactly. We'll take care of you. You can Jim will coach you. Um, no, it's that's the thing. Tapering is, and it can change throughout the year. Like I said, it can change throughout someone's training life, and
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on the strategy that you're trying to use. That's another thing that kind of goes along with the whole topic of tapering is this notion of building up this big fatigue debt, and then by dumping that fatigue debt in the last week or 2 weeks from the meet, that you're somehow going to slingshot your strength progress ahead. I haven't seen that happen very much, and I can tell you from the Project Momentum results that we looked at, we didn't see that happen very much there. The people that got beat down didn't do as well. The people that felt fully recovered did great, you know. So I don't know. That was an interesting thing, you know.
well, I feel like tapering can be also used as just a little bit of leeway to really just finesse the finishing bits of the training. So if somebody's fully recovered, they might not need to taper. Now, if somebody is really stressed, high stress, low recovery, and they're still 100% committed to the meet, then they might need more taper just to get them a little more even.
Well, that's
But
a really good point about individualizing it, you know.
right.
So another thing that I've noticed from doing track tests on athletes going into competitions, some athletes get really stressed out just by the prospect of going to a competition.
Hmm.
Right. So if we think of, your stress, you use the kitchen sink analogy again, so we have all these stress inflows. Normally training is a really predominant stress inflow in your body. Processes that's the outflow. You don't let the sink overflow. So if you're not familiar with this kitchen sink analogy, that's the nuts and bolts of it. Um, so for some people, when they're going into a competition, just like, I'm not sure exactly what it is. Maybe it's just like the subconscious processing of going into a stressful environment. Maybe it's travel if they've got a travel event or something like that. Um, but there's more stress inflow in a situation like that. And they don't handle training volume as well as they do when it's just a normal, normal loading period, you know. So in a situation like that, like, yeah, you've got to pay attention. Like, the coach has to pay attention, right? And adjust those values so that you're bringing an athlete in that's at the right level. That it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be, zero fatigue, but you definitely don't want the sink overflowing either. You know, you've got to manage that.
Right, and that's the way that I use tapering when I can, is just literally just kind of dialing it in at the very last to get the most out of the athlete, to get the most out of the lifter.
Yeah.
Yeah, track's really helpful for that. Like one of my lifters just competed Saturday, and I didn't want to tell her how we were going to taper because, I mean, obviously she had an understanding of what we could do, but I didn't want to make a clear decision until I knew, on that Sunday before the meet, how she was feeling and like what her track score was, and she was a little bit fatigued. And then subjectively, even she told me, I'm feeling real fatigued. So I said, all right, let's just do one. Instead of just doing openers on Monday, we did a modified workout from like what we were used to, and then the rest of the week was just openers on Wednesday. So it wasn't totally traditional, and it wasn't totally just a run through meet. It was kind of a combination of the two to, like you said, dial it in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's responsible coaching. That's what should happen, right? Yeah.
And something interesting about that is that people can't do that for themselves. They have, because of everything we just cited, people have a really hard time doing their own tapering because of their expectations of what they decide. So, this is not, I don't want this to be a commercial for coaching, but this is why people need a coach if they want to perform at a high level, because we can be objective.
Yeah.
We can kind of stand outside of their fatigue, stress, and ego and tell them like it is, the way that we see it. So maybe this is just to say coaching is good. That's,
I mean, at a minimum, you need to have a system, right? And
Yes.
like I totally get it that like you're saying, of course, coaching is good, and that's why we do what we do. But um, for those stubborn people or people for whatever reason don't want to do coaching, that's fine. But you need to at least work to develop a system that puts all these pieces in proper context. You know, because the tendency, especially as you near a major event, so like let's say you're a lifter and you're nearing the biggest competition of your yearly calendar. Whether it's nationals or whatever. That's going to be stressful and that's going to affect you emotionally. And otherwise, if you don't have some sort of system for placing these things into context, it's really, really easy to let those emotions carry decisions that you shouldn't necessarily make emotionally. That's what you're saying that a coach can do for you. But if you don't have that, then you need to have some sort of a system for placing those things in context. Track attempts to do that, but it's really designed to be more of a training tool, not necessarily a tapering device. But I mean, if you understand what you're looking at, then understand what you're trying to create, then that's fine. But usually, I find that it's more high-level coaches that have that understanding. Other people tend not to, and that's not a dig against average coaches or just self-coached athletes or anything like that. That's just an observation of what I see.
Well, I mean, it just takes time. It takes time and experience. It's not. I don't think it's a dig at all. But I mean, honestly, for me, it's something that an uncoached lifter can strive towards. That's kind of the next level, and then a novice or intermediate coach can also strive towards a higher level of understanding. And then every advanced coach out there, everybody can know more and do better. And I
Yeah.
think that we learn from every single coaching experience, and we look back at it and we say, hey, you know, that worked, that didn't work. Let's see if there's any kind of common ground here between, and something that we can bring to our next go around.
Right.
No digs there, I don't
That's
think.
something that I talk about in the classroom lessons as well. So like for mesocycles, the first lesson really is about programming structure, and it's to give us a framework, a process that we go through when we're building a training program. But something that's immediately obvious or very close to immediately obvious once you start looking at this programming structure is that it's very dependent on the strategy. It's very dependent on having some knowledge of what the training effects are. It doesn't build
Hmm.
itself. You have to bring something to the table here. You've got to understand if I program pin squats, what does that do to the athlete? Both positive and negative. And you've got to understand those things. And it's not a binary condition. It's not like person A doesn't understand, person B understands. It's there's this gradient. You can always understand it a little bit better with a little bit more granularity. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess that's just a long-winded way of saying what you're saying is that there's always more to learn. You know.
Yeah, and to me, it's fun. It's a that's
That's the
that's
point,
that's
right?
yeah, exactly. It's a lot of fun just trying to figure these things out and then just seeing how they work. Um yeah, it's fun. Jim, you don't look like you're having fun.
Well, I was wanting to say something on that notion. When I was thinking about physical therapists, or really anyone, that comes out of college and they study, physical therapy or, orthopedic surgery. I don't know, something crazy. But they learn all this stuff from their teachers and their lectures and their books and everything like that. But, I've been talking to a few physical therapists, and for the most part, they're like, yeah, a lot of this stuff you need to have the understanding of the structure, but it's all trial and error after that, because the book isn't written for every single person ever. It's just written from their experiences and what we currently understand. So as we learn more about the individual, we have to make modifications no matter what is supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. It's a lot of people say that. So I got in a little bit of trouble. Not trouble, I guess, but some people didn't like a comment that I made on Facebook a little bit ago. I said something to that effect, like um, textbook knowledge is provides your foundation, but you have to go beyond that. I was talking more about technique, and lifting technique. That having an understanding of textbook technique is an important foundation, but you've got to go beyond that, and that's not about violating those fundamentals. It's about understanding them better, applying them to different contexts, taking them to the next level, basically, and that we kind of don't pay much attention to that in the powerlifting world. There's textbook technique, and that's kind of it. Some people didn't think that was such a great observation to make, which is their right, I guess. But
It's
you see that in a lot of different disciplines, though. Like you're talking about physical therapy. My brother is he's an IT professional, so he majored in computer science. Says the same thing. Like you go to school, you learn all these things, and then you get to the real world, and they're like, yeah, it's good that you know that, but that's not how it really works.
Well, it's like that, and it kind of works like that, but like there's a little bit more modification and tweaking. It's not like we're trying to rip on people that go to school and learn this stuff. Yeah, a lot of that is important, but
so Jim says don't go to school. All right.
don't go to school to start from day one, trial and error, have no
Put that in
fundamental.
the show notes, right?
Yeah.
But so I think to sum that up, the main thing is that you need a foundation. But once you have that foundation, you need to become your own person. You need to become your own coach, and you build that on your experiences. You build that on your lifters' experiences, and if you have the right mindset, you can go pretty far. You can learn a lot.
Yeah. It's a much more succinct way of putting it, Paulie. You have a gift for these things.
For succinct words. My dad, he was a journalist. I think that's where I learned it from. So a news guy. So he only had 30 seconds to say things.
All right. Yeah,
All sound bites.
I was looking at one of the podcasts that we did, and I thought, well, let me see if I can find like a 15-second clip that I'm gonna take and post on Instagram. And I don't have any thoughts that are 15 seconds or less. I have pauses that are 15 seconds where I just sit here and think for a moment.
That's what that'll be the thoughtful mic. We'll put that on Instagram.
All right. Well, I think that's about all the time that we wanted to spend talking about tapering. But yeah, good information there. I think a lot of information there. A little bit rambly. That's fine. But all right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for hanging out. It was good chatting with you about tapering.
Reactive Training Systems.